Story 1. 101 years ago, a massive tank of molasses burst open in Boston, causing a sticky wave that killed 21 people and injured well over 100. The Great Molasses Flood spread at about 35 miles per hour. Story 2. Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was present at 3 different presidential assassinations. After McKinley, he decided not to accept any more invitations. Story 3. When Alexander the Great was a child, he was reprimanded by a teacher for wastefully throwing 2 whole fistfuls of rare incense into a sacrificial fire. When he was an adult and captured Gaza, which happened to be the prime agricultural source of the incense he wasted, he sent 18 tons of it home to the same teacher as a gift. Story 4. Former United States President Andrew Jackson was approached by a man who pulled a gun on him. This was the first assassination attempt on a United States president. The man pulled the trigger and the cap went off, but the gunpowder failed to ignite. He pulled a second gun and fired, but again the gunpowder failed to ignite. The assassin tried to get away, but not before Andrew Jackson caught him and beat him with a cane. Story 5. Potatoes were not very popular as a food in France, as they were seen as fit only for animals. Not only that, but they were considered generally not digestible by humans. A pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier knew they were good food and wanted to popularize them among the working class. He acquired a 2-acre farm to grow potatoes and placed armed guards around it at all times. People assumed armed guards meant something very valuable was growing there, so they began to steal the potatoes. That's how potatoes became popular in France's working class. Story 6. During the Cold War, there was an idea to drop extra-large condoms labeled medium onto the Soviets to make them think we were anatomically superior and be more afraid of fighting us. Easily my favorite part of American history. Story 7. American military members were also killed during the nuclear bombings of Japan. When American High Command was informed of their presence, their response was something like, "Targets remain unchanged." Story 8. Pepsi once had the 6th largest military in the world after the price of Russian vodka couldn't cover their deal for Pepsi products. So they traded 17 submarines, a frigate, a cruiser, and a destroyer for a trade deal. Fun fact, the president of Pepsi Company at the time told the National Security Advisor, "We are disarming the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics faster than you are." Story 9. General Omar Bradley was stopped by military police during the Battle of the Bulge in World War II because they thought he was a Nazi infiltrator. The irony was that he was stopped because he correctly identified the capital of Illinois as Springfield, while the officer thought it was Chicago. Story 10. Montenegro was technically at war with Japan for 101 years, and they signed a peace treaty in 2006. Montenegro was aligned with Russia during the Russo-Japanese War and declared war on Japan, but they forgot to make peace. Story 11. In 1967, Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt disappeared while swimming in the ocean. He was presumed drowned, so that year we named a swim center after him in memoriam. Edit. Added his name, which I meant to do when I wrote the post, but obviously my brain snapped midway through the sentence and I forgot it. Story 12. 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis. The first-place finisher drove most of the race. He started the race, got tired and heat-exhausted, and wanted to drop out. He got in a car to disqualify himself and head back to the stadium, but along the way realized he was near the finish line and got out to claim the glory. The second-place finisher was carried across the finish line by his trainers. On a bogus pseudoscience theory, the trainers had been giving him a mixture of brandy, egg whites, and rat poison instead of water. When it came out that the first-place finisher had driven most of the course, this man was given the gold despite the help from his trainers to finish. For some reason, the third-place finisher was just a regular guy who did nothing unusual. In this case, ordinary was extraordinary. The fourth-place finisher was a Cuban mailman who had raised the money to attend the Olympics by running around his entire country and asking for donations. When he landed in New Orleans, he lost all the money gambling. He managed to scrounge enough to get to St. Louis and attend the Olympics. However, he had no money for athletic gear, so he ran in dress shoes and pants hacked off at the knee by a fellow racer who happened to have a knife. He probably would have come in first had it not been for the hour-long nap, he took on the side of the road after eating rotten apples he found at an orchard near the course. The 9th and 12th place finishers were from South Africa and ran barefoot. South Africa didn't actually send a delegation. These were students who just happened to be in town and thought it sounded fun. The 9th place finisher was chased a mile off course by angry dogs. Half the participants had never raced competitively before. Some died. St. Louis only had one water stop on the entire run. This, coupled with the dusty road and exacerbated by the cars kicking up dust, led to several fatalities. The Russian delegation arrived a week late because they were still using the Julian calendar until 1918, while effectively the rest of the world had switched to the Gregorian calendar. Story 13. Once Franklin D. Roosevelt died, Truman did not know about the Manhattan Project, but when he found out, he subtly tried to tell Stalin they were working on something significant. Stalin responded by saying he knew before Truman did, as he had many spies in America. Story 14. Henry Cavendish was vital in the discovery of gases and discovered hydrogen. He inherited a large amount of money from his uncle and built a special castle. Cavendish was incredibly introverted, so it was designed so that he never had to meet or see any of his servants. He communicated with them through notes only. He did, however, appreciate other scientists coming to visit and talk. His works mostly came after his death, but I found him interesting. Story 15. In 1908, there was a car race around the world that started in New York City. The route would start in New York City to San Francisco to Valdez, Alaska, across the Bering Strait, through Russia and Europe, with the finish line in Paris. Cars were relatively new and road infrastructure was limited to only metropolitan areas, and even then, a lot of it was cobblestone. But what you might have thought is, how in the world can a car get across the Pacific? They would drive across the Bering Strait during the winter when it froze into an ice bridge. The race began in February 1908 and immediately ran into challenges. To list a few: cars breaking down multiple times, lack of usable roads, car-hating people giving wrong directions, and snow. The first team reached San Francisco in 41 days but quickly realized that the proposed route from San Francisco to Alaska did not exist. So the organizers allowed teams to ship their cars to Valdez, Alaska, then continue on the ice bridge. Once in Valdez, the teams found out that there is, in fact, no ice bridge across the Bering Strait anymore because it melted about 20,000 years ago. Small oversight. Organizers then allowed teams to ship their cars across the Pacific to Japan, then Russia to carry on. Despite all unpredictable and hilariously predictable odds, the winning team arrived in Paris 169 days later. Highly recommend listening about it from the Dollop podcast. There's more nonsense that happens that I couldn't fit in or remember. Story 16. Hannibal's defeat of the Romans at Lake Trasimene. By leaving soldiers to light fires in the hills, he created the illusion that his army was 3 days' march away, when tens of thousands of men were actually concealed in the hills just above the lake. The Romans were surprised on the shore and trapped between the onslaught and the water. In their armor, half of the 30,000 Roman troops were either killed in battle or drowned in the lake. 5,000 were captured, and the other 10,000 staggered back to Rome, creating panic that the greatest army in the world had just been defeated by a Carthaginian upstart. It was the greatest ambush in military history. Story 17. During the Viking era, there was a leader named Sigurd. He allied with a Viking warlord named Thorstein. He wanted to conquer more land and expand his territory. He had already been very successful in doing so. This was until he feuded with another leader called Male Bucktoothed or Male Tusk, as his front two teeth were abnormally large and buck-toothed. They decided to settle their matters on the battlefield and both agreed on bringing 40 men each for the battle. However, Sigurd ignored the terms and brought 80 men. Bucktoothed realized he had been betrayed but did not give up. They killed a number of Sigurd's men, but alas, they were overpowered and were all killed. Here's the catch. After the battle, Sigurd ordered his men to behead all the enemies and tie them to their saddles as trophies. However, as Sigurd rode home in victory, the severed head of Bucktoothed pierced his leg, which led to an infection, killing him soon after. Story 18. The capture of the Dutch fleet at Den Helder on the night of January 23, 1795 presents a rare occurrence of a naval battle between warships and cavalry, in which a French Revolutionary Hussar regiment captured a Dutch Republican fleet frozen at anchor between the 3-kilometer stretch of sea that separates the mainland port of Den Helder and the island of Texel. After a charge across the frozen Zuiderzee, the French cavalry captured 14 Dutch ships and 850 guns. A capture of ships by horsemen is an extremely rare feat in military history. Story 19. The state of Washington was named Washington instead of Columbia so that it would not be confused with the District of Columbia, as it was commonly known at the time. Story 20. There used to be bread stamps burned into a cooked loaf of bread to avoid bread fraud, as the government supplied the wheat and flour. However, some bakers tried to use sawdust and other ingredients in the bread to make the wheat last longer. The bread stamps were specific to each baker so they could track down where any tainted bread came from. If they were caught, they had to move to another town to make bread or wait 3 years to continue making bread, if I remember correctly. Story 21. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of them both signing the Declaration of Independence. Adams's last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong by about 5 hours. Story 22. Pythagoras drowned a student because the student proved the existence of irrational numbers, which contradicted Pythagoras and his brotherhood's beliefs. Story 23. The Battle of Bull Run, during the American Civil War, was called the Picnic Battle because so many civilians from Washington went on picnics on the sidelines and watched. But once the battle actually started, and the Union started to get its soldiers defeated, they all ran away, running over injured soldiers and dead bodies and generally disrupting the battle. This was actually a relatively common thing during the Civil War. I know it happened at Gettysburg too. Story 24. Claudius Drusus died in AD 20 from asphyxiation when he tossed a pear in the air and caught it in his mouth. The pear tree was put on trial, found guilty of murder, and destroyed. Story 25. When the Romans laid siege to Themyscira, a real place weirdly enough, they attempted to tunnel into the city. The Themiscyrians released bears into the tunnels. Story 26. Ancient Greek and Roman marble statues were actually originally painted and were colorful. A lot of the statues' paint faded away over time. Some people cleaned off the paint, thinking it was debris or dirt, and others simply removed all of the paint because they preferred the look of white marble. Rome was actually a very colorful city, and it wasn't all made of just plain white marble. Story 27. There are literally entire books of anecdotes of this sort on Ben Franklin. That man was the original gangster of trolling. He was so good at trolling under the pen name of a female, Silence Dogood, he received several marriage proposals. Only then did he reveal her true identity. Story 28. As St. Lawrence was roasted to death on a gridiron, he is said to have remarked to his torturers, "I am cooked on this side. Turn me over." St. Lawrence is the patron saint of cooks and comedians. Story 29. The Pastry War. A French pastry chef who lived in the outskirts of Mexico City wrote a letter of complaint to King Louis Philippe, claiming that in 1832 the Mexican army damaged his shop and stole several cakes. He demanded 60,000 pesos from the Mexican government, which ignored the request. After this incident, King Louis Philippe decided to block all ports of entry in the Gulf of Mexico, which later led to the French invasion of Veracruz. Story 30. In the 1927 Liberian elections, described as the most rigged ever by Francis Johnson Morris, a modern head of the country's National Elections Commission, and recorded in the Guinness Book of Records as the most fraudulent election in history, despite there being fewer than 15,000 registered voters, King received around 243,000 votes compared to 9,000 for Faulkner. Story 31. The Massachusetts Colony Band celebrating Christmas. During that time period, many people used it as an excuse to get drunk and party. Another tradition was that young adults would cross-dress, then go door to door singing songs and demanding food. This clearly didn't fit with the Puritan lifestyle, so the governor banned public celebrations. People could still celebrate it in their homes if they didn't get too rowdy. I think it was unbanned when Massachusetts became a state, but it didn't become mainstream until Christmas became a national holiday. Nashville briefly legalized prostitution during the Civil War. Union soldiers stationed there kept getting syphilis, so the known prostitutes were put on a large barge in the river. I'm a little unclear on what happened after that, but I know it didn't work very well. So it was legalized, and prostitutes had to be registered or get a license, I can't remember which, and were required to have STD checks. This lowered the number of prostitutes with syphilis because it was getting caught and treated. That lowered the number of soldiers getting syphilis and made the army happy. It was outlawed shortly after the war ended, though. Story 32. 2 separate times that we know of, one single man has stopped the world from going into thermonuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis and the American blockade of Russian ships to the island, a Russian submarine on patrol was found by the Americans and was under soft attack. Ships were dropping depth charges on them to try and get them to surface and communicate. Of the 3 officers on board, 2 wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo in retaliation. Vasily Arkhipov disagreed and was able to prevent the launch because it required unanimous agreement. They surfaced and didn't start World War III. The second man was working at an early warning station in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they falsely detected a missile attack from America. Stanislav Petrov stalled the alarms and prevented a preemptive counterattack. 25 minutes later, he got confirmation it was a glitch and had also prevented World War III. There have also been countless other accidents involving nuclear weapons throughout the decades, with many coming dangerously close to triggering an unintentional explosion. We're lucky, to say the least, to have avoided catastrophe so far.